War is rarely defined by a single event, yet history remembers moments when the tide shifted almost overnight. In the chaos of the Second World War, when millions of men and women were locked in a brutal struggle stretching across continents, a breakthrough emerged that altered the course of battle in a way few could have predicted. A secret weapon, conceived in desperation and perfected through ingenuity, would change the balance of power in just 72 hours. To understand how such a rapid transformation was possible, we must go back to the early years of the conflict, an era when the future of Europe and perhaps the world itself hung in the balance. The German war machine, forged by Hitler's relentless ambition, had torn through Europe with terrifying speed. Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was more than a strategy. It was a new form of warfare combining tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry into a single devastating spearhead. By the summer of 1940, France had collapsed, Britain stood alone, and the Soviet Union loomed as the next great battleground. But even the might of the Third Reich could not withstand the grinding demands of global war. As the months turned to years, the Allies began to fight back, not just with manpower and courage, but with science, engineering, and innovation. Behind the front lines in laboratories, factories, and secret testing grounds, men and women worked around the clock to find an edge. And in 1943, such an edge appeared. It was not a massive bomber fleet nor a mighty battleship. It was not even a new type of tank or aircraft. It was something smaller, something deceptively simple and yet devastatingly effective. A weapon that, when unleashed, turned the momentum of the battlefield in the Allies' favor in a matter of days. But how did it come to be, and why did it have such an immediate and dramatic impact? Story begins in the skies over Europe. By 1943, the Allies faced a critical problem. Their bombing campaigns, designed to cripple German industry and weaken morale, were meeting fierce resistance. The Luftwaffe, though stretched thin, still possessed formidable fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. These planes cut through Allied bomber formations with deadly precision, turning missions over Germany into near-suicidal undertakings. Losses were catastrophic. The solution lay in extending the protective reach of Allied fighters. Bombers needed escorts that could accompany them deep into enemy territory, protect them from interception, and return safely. But no fighter in the Allied arsenal could manage the distances required. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the early Spitfires were powerful machines, but their range was limited. The bombers were left vulnerable in the most dangerous stretches of their missions. That vulnerability threatened the entire Allied strategy. If the bomber campaign collapsed, the dream of opening a second front in Europe could falter. The fate of the war might hang on the ability to sustain pressure against Germany's industrial heartland. In late 1943, the breakthrough came. Engineers and tacticians combined ingenuity with necessity and created a solution so effective it would alter the aerial war within a single week. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, transformed the skis. Its range, speed, and maneuverability allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Within 72 hours of its first major deployment, the Luftwaffe began to crumble under the relentless assault of bombers protected by this new guardian. The Mustang was sleek, fast, and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. But its story is not simply about engineering brilliance. It is also about politics, industrial cooperation, and the desperate urgency of wartime innovation. In this weapon, American manufacturing combined with British engine design, bridging national lines in a union that would prove decisive. The effect was immediate. For the first time, the Allies could strike deep into Germany with confidence. Bombers that once faced near annihilation now completed missions with drastically reduced losses. Fighter pilots, emboldened by their new mounts, hunted the Luftwaffe aggressively, decimating the ranks of German aces and stripping the Reich of its once dominant air force. But this change was not only tactical, it was psychological. In Berlin, Hitler raged as he realized the skis he once considered safe were now open corridors for Allied firepower. German civilians who had once watched Allied bombers fall in flames now saw them pass overhead in ever-growing numbers, escorted by fighters that seemed unstoppable. The weapon that changed the war in 72 hours was not a bomb, not a tank, not a miracle of destructive power. It was the ability to project protection, to extend dominance into the heart of enemy territory, and to wrest control of the skis from the Luftwaffe. Yet this story cannot be told without stepping into the lives of those who flew these machines, the men who climbed into cockpits not knowing if they would return, and the engineers who worked in hidden workshops to perfect a design that history almost forgot. In the next part of our story, we'll uncover the origins of the Mustang, the debates that nearly prevented its existence, and the dramatic first missions that proved its worth beyond all doubt. The story of the weapon that reshaped the skis does not begin with its first battle, but with a gamble, one born of necessity, skepticism, and persistence. To understand the full impact of the Mustang, we must first look back at its unexpected origins. In 1940, Britain faced a crisis of survival. France had fallen and the Luftwaffe pounded British cities in what came to be known as the Blitz. The Royal Air Force fought valiantly with Spitfires and Hurricanes, but production was stretched thin. In desperation, British officials turned to the United States, still officially neutral at the time, with a request: could North American aviation produce fighter aircraft to help fill the gap? At first, the British asked for Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, a design already in American service. But North American's President James Kindleberger made a bold promise. Instead of building an existing fighter, his company would design and produce an entirely new aircraft, one that could be ready within months. The proposal seemed reckless. Aircraft design often took years, yet Kindleberger's engineers believed they could deliver something superior in record time. They were right. Within just 117 days, the prototype of what would become the P-51 Mustang took to the skies. It was fast, agile, and modern. But while the British were intrigued, the aircraft was initially seen as underwhelming in combat. The early models, fitted with the Allison V1710 engine, struggled at high altitudes, precisely where air battles over Europe were being fought. In short, the Mustang was good but not great. For a time, it seemed destined to be a footnote in aviation history, useful perhaps as a ground attack aircraft but unable to challenge the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies above Germany. Then came the turning point. Britain. Rolls-Royce engineers saw potential in the Mustang's design. They recognized its aerodynamic frame was superior to most fighters but hampered by its engine. Their solution was simple yet revolutionary: replace the Allison with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. With its two-stage supercharger, the Merlin allowed the Mustang to reach incredible performance at high altitudes, where strategic bombing campaigns were decided. The transformation was immediate. In test flights, the new Mustang variants outperformed not only German aircraft but even many Allied fighters. Its range, previously limited, extended so far that it could escort bombers to Berlin and back without refueling, a feat no other Allied fighter could match. By late 1943, American factories were retooling en masse to produce the Merlin-powered Mustangs. The cooperation between British design and American industry was a rare example of wartime synergy, bridging not only nations but philosophies. What emerged was more than an aircraft; it was a weapon tailored to the very strategy the Allies needed most. The first combat deployment of the new Mustang came at a critical moment. Allied bomber losses over Germany were unsustainable. Raids on targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had ended in disaster, with dozens of B-17 flying fortresses shot from the sky in single missions. Morale among bomber crews was collapsing. Even the promise of daylight precision bombing seemed on the verge of failure. But in early 1944, the Mustang entered the fray. Its first mission stunned both friend and foe. For the first time, bombers did not fly into the heart of Germany alone. They were accompanied by sleek, agile escorts that not only defended them but actively sought out the Luftwaffe. Mustang pilots pursued German fighters relentlessly, engaging them far from bomber formations and forcing them into battles of attrition they could no longer afford. Within 72 hours of their large-scale introduction, the skis were transformed. Losses among bombers dropped sharply. Luftwaffe pilots, once accustomed to dominating the air, now faced opponents who could match or exceed them in every metric: speed, climb rate, range, and firepower. For the men in the cockpits, the change was visceral. Bomber crews who had once braced for annihilation began to return home in greater numbers. Pilots in the Mustang spoke of newfound confidence, their aircraft able to dive, climb, and turn with astonishing precision. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by shortages of fuel and experienced pilots, now found itself locked in a battle it could not win. But behind the triumph lay deeper consequences. German industry, already straining under Allied bombing, now faced unrelenting pressure. Factories were destroyed, supply chains shattered, and the once mighty Luftwaffe began to collapse. By mid-1944, the Allies not only commanded the skis, they had stripped Germany of one of its most potent defenses. The Mustang was more than a weapon of war. It was a symbol of industrial might, of international cooperation, and of how innovation could alter the fate of millions in a matter of days. Yet, to fully grasp its impact, we must hear the voices of those who flew it, fought against it, and depended on its presence to survive. In the next chapter, we will step inside the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang, follow the harrowing first missions of its pilots, and witness the dramatic battles where this aircraft proved itself as the weapon that changed the war in just 72 hours. The debut of the Mustang was not just a mechanical breakthrough, it was a lifeline for the men who had been flying into German airspace under constant threat. To understand the impact of this weapon, we must hear the story not in technical terms, but in the voices of those who lived it. By late 1943, bomber crews of the United States 8th Air Force were bracing themselves for missions that felt like suicide. A daylight raid over Germany meant hours in the air, a gauntlet of flak guns, and then inevitably the black shapes of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rising to meet them. Many B-17 crews described the sensation as being inside a flying coffin. Once the fighters appeared, they had little choice but to endure the assault. Survival was a matter of luck. For every 100 bombers dispatched, as many as a third never returned. Men spoke of counting empty bunks in their barracks after missions, a grim reminder that each raid carved away at their ranks. Some wondered aloud whether the campaign could continue at all. Then came the Mustang. On January 1944, the first long-range escort missions began in earnest. As formations of bombers crossed into Germany, enemy fighters appeared, confident in their familiar strategy. But this time, things were different. The Luftwaffe dived toward the bombers, only to be met by Mustangs waiting for them at altitude. What followed was chaos in the skies. The German pilots, accustomed to attacking with relative impunity, suddenly found themselves hunted. Mustang pilots did not merely defend the bombers, they pursued, chased, and destroyed. Dogfights erupted across the horizon. Some bomber crews reported seeing Mustangs peel away from their protective formations, racing to meet German squadrons before they could even close in. The effect was immediate and electrifying. In a single 72-hour window, mission reports documented a stunning reversal. Bombing runs, once considered too dangerous, now returned with far fewer casualties. German fighters, shot down in alarming numbers, began to thin. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a formidable force, boasting elite pilots with hundreds of kills to their names. But years of attrition, compounded by fuel shortages and the relentless demands of the Eastern Front, had left them stretched. The sudden arrival of the Mustang was more than they could absorb. Every loss of an experienced pilot was irreplaceable, while the Allies, with their vast training programs and industrial production, could replenish their ranks. One Mustang pilot later recalled, "We weren't just escorting, we were hunting. Every time we saw a German fighter, we went for them. The bombers weren't alone anymore, and the Luftwaffe knew it." Another bomber crewman described the transformation in stark terms. "Before, you'd watch the clock waiting for the fighters to appear and tear us apart. That dread, it ate at you, but after the Mustangs came, it was different. You'd see them up there, sleek, fast, cutting through the Germans, and you'd think, maybe we'll make it home today." The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. For the first time, the Allies had the confidence to strike deep into the heart of Germany. Berlin, once a distant target out of reach, was now within the range of escorted bombers. German civilians who had once found some measure of comfort in watching Allied bombers fall in flames now saw them return in growing waves, protected, persistent, unstoppable. For the Luftwaffe, the sense of inevitability was crushing. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, overseeing German air production, lamented openly about the inability to counter the new Allied escorts. Even Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, is reported to have admitted with bitterness that when he saw Mustangs flying over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Yet the battles were far from bloodless. Mustang pilots paid dearly for their victories. Missions could stretch for hours, and dogfights demanded absolute concentration. A single mistake meant death in a spiral of smoke and fire. The aircraft may have been superior, but the men inside still faced the same razor-thin margin between survival and oblivion. Archival footage shows squadrons returning, empty cockpits among the ranks. Each triumph carried the cost of comrades who did not come back. But the numbers told the larger story. In the early months of 1944, Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. The Germans were not just losing aircraft, they were losing the experienced veterans who had once been the backbone of their defense. In their place came younger, less skilled pilots thrown into combat with only minimal training. Against the Mustang, they had little chance. The skis, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now tilted decisively toward the Allies. In just 72 hours of combat, the balance of power shifted, and it would never shift back. Still, to appreciate the full scale of this transformation, we must step back and see how this aerial dominance rippled outward, how it opened the way for new strategies, how it shaped the coming invasion of Europe, and how it sealed Germany's fate long before Allied troops set foot on Normandy's beaches. In the next part, we will explore how the Mustang's presence paved the way for D-Day, how air supremacy became the cornerstone of Allied victory, and how this weapon's legacy would stretch far beyond the war itself. By early 1944, the Allies had achieved something that had seemed impossible only a year earlier. They had not only survived the relentless onslaught of the Luftwaffe, they had turned the skis into a weapon of their own. At the center of this transformation was the Mustang, sleek and unrelenting, tearing through enemy squadrons and standing guard over the bomber streams. But this change did more than save lives in the air. It reshaped the entire war on the ground. The invasion of Western Europe, what history remembers as D-Day, was not only a feat of soldiers storming beaches and tanks rolling inland. It was the culmination of months of preparation, deception, and logistical mastery. But above all, it depended on one condition: control of the skis. Without air supremacy, the landings in Normandy would have been suicide. German reinforcements could have poured into the battle zone unimpeded. Luftwaffe fighters could have strafed and bombed the beaches, turning them into killing grounds. The Allies knew it. And so, long before a single landing craft crossed the channel, the fight for Europe was already being decided in the skis above Germany. This was the role the Mustang made possible. By spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Mission after mission, Mustang pilots tore into the ranks of German interceptors, while bombers shattered fuel refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation hubs. The Germans found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win. Every week, their reserves grew thinner, their pilots younger, their fuel scarcer. The Allies called this campaign the Transportation Plan. Its goal was simple: cripple Germany's ability to move men and materiel to the front. With Mustangs clearing the skis, bombers flew deep into the Reich with near impunity, dismantling the very infrastructure the Wehrmacht needed to defend France. In German villages and cities, the effect was devastating. Trains lay crippled in rail yards, fuel depots went up in flames, bridges collapsed under relentless bombardment. Civilians spoke of skis that never seemed empty, of sirens that wailed endlessly, of a constant rain of destruction from an enemy they could not stop. For the Wehrmacht, the consequences were fatal. When Allied troops finally stormed ashore in June 1944, German units found themselves starved of supplies, unable to mobilize reserves quickly, their movements constantly harassed by aircraft overhead. Panzer divisions that should have reached Normandy within hours instead took days, crawling through ruined rail lines and strafed roadways, all under the ever-watchful eye of Allied fighters. And the Mustang was there every step of the way. Pilots flew fighter sweeps, racing ahead of the invasion forces, cutting down any Luftwaffe aircraft that dared to rise. They strafed columns of trucks, tore through armored convoys, and left German defenders scrambling for cover. A single flight of Mustangs could decimate an entire stretch of road, leaving burning wreckage in its wake. The men on the ground noticed. Allied soldiers, pinned under fire in the hedgerows of Normandy, often spoke of the relief that came when the roar of Mustangs echoed overhead. To them, the aircraft was not just a machine, it was hope, salvation from the ever-present fear of German counterattack. Even German officers recognized the turning point. General Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall, confided to his staff that without control of the air, the battle was lost before it even began. His words were prophetic. The sheer dominance of Allied air power meant that, for the first time in the war, German strategy was reactive rather than proactive. They could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Instead, they were forced into desperate measures, scattering their forces, hiding under cover of darkness, and watching helplessly as their mobility was strangled by the relentless attacks. The Mustang's contribution to this supremacy cannot be overstated. It was the spearhead of a campaign that left the German army crippled and the Luftwaffe shattered. In just a few months, the weapon that had proven itself in 72 hours became the cornerstone of Allied strategy, ensuring that when the invasion came, the skis were already won. The beaches of Normandy would be remembered as the moment when Europe began to be freed from Nazi control. But the truth is, the battle for those beaches was won in the skis above them, won by the pilots who flew the Mustang, the bombers they escorted, and the engineers who gave them the tools to dominate. Yet even as victory loomed, the struggle was far from over. The Luftwaffe was broken but not yet destroyed. Desperate German innovations, jet fighters, rocket weapons, and other so-called miracle solutions emerged as the Reich clawed for survival. The Mustang and the men who flew it would face these threats head-on in the final year of the war. In the next part of our story, we will step into that final chapter: the desperate German countermeasures, the rise of the jet age, and how even as the war neared its bloody conclusion, the Mustang remained at the heart of Allied supremacy. By mid-1944, the Reich was crumbling under the weight of Allied advances. The Eastern Front was bleeding Germany dry, and in the West, the Allies had landed in France and begun their march toward the heart of Europe. Yet even as the Wehrmacht reeled, Hitler placed his faith in what he called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons that, he believed, could reverse the tide of war. Foremost among these was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Sleek, fast, and armed with devastating 13 cannons, it represented a technological leap that on paper threatened to undo the Mustang's hard-won supremacy. Capable of speeds far beyond any piston-driven aircraft, the Me 262 could swoop through bomber formations with terrifying effectiveness. Allied airmen who first encountered it described it as a machine from another world. But speed alone does not win wars. The Me 262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. German industry, ravaged by Allied bombing and starved of critical resources, could not produce them in the quantities needed. Pilots were scarce, fuel scarcer still, and even the mighty jet had weaknesses. It was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its engines were slow to respond. It was then that the Mustang proved its worth once again. Allied intelligence quickly learned to target Me 262 airfields. Squadrons of Mustangs would orbit above, waiting for jets to appear. As the German aircraft struggled to climb or slowed to land, the Mustangs pounced, shooting them down before they could use their speed to escape. In one mission, Mustang pilots destroyed multiple Me 262s on approach, leaving smoking wreckage across runways that had once promised Germany salvation. Pilots who faced the jets admitted their speed was unmatched, but confidence remained high. As one veteran Mustang pilot put it, "If we caught them at the right moment, they were as vulnerable as anything else." The Luftwaffe's desperate reliance on such weapons reflected its collapse. Gone were the days of overwhelming numbers and experienced aces dominating the skis. Instead, the Reich gambled on technology to mask its weakness. Alongside the Me 262 came the rocket-powered Me 163 Comet and the terror weapons of the V-1 and V-2 rockets. But none of these could change the fact that Germany no longer controlled its airspace. The Mustang remained ever-present, a hunter in the skis, escorting bombers on missions that left German cities in ruins, factories crippled, and fuel depots drained. The Luftwaffe was not just beaten in combat, it was strangled day by day until it could no longer rise to defend the Reich. By late 1944, the numbers told a grim story. German fighter losses were catastrophic, while Allied production surged. The United States was producing thousands of Mustangs, replacing lost aircraft with ease, while German factories struggled to push out even a fraction of that number. Worse still, many German pilots being rushed into combat had less than a dozen hours of training in their aircraft before being thrown against Allied veterans. Against the Mustang, their chances were almost non-existent. And so, as the Allies closed in on the borders of Germany, the once mighty Luftwaffe became a ghost of its former self. Bombers flew deeper, fighters pressed harder, and the Reich's last hopes of stemming the tide disintegrated under the roar of Merlin engines. Yet even in its collapse, the Luftwaffe fought with desperation. Jet fighters and rocket interceptors, though rare, still claimed lives. Every Mustang pilot knew the danger of chasing an Me 262 too close to its airfield or being caught in the path of a desperate German counterattack. The skis remained deadly until the very end. But the truth was undeniable. The Mustang had ensured that the Luftwaffe could never recover. It had broken not just an air force but a myth that German skis were invincible, that Allied bombers could never reach Berlin, that Hitler's Reich was untouchable. As 1945 dawned, Allied armies prepared to cross the Rhine and push into the heart of Germany itself. Above them, the Mustangs flew, guardians of the skis, watching over the final act of the war in Europe. In the next part, we will follow the closing months of the conflict, how the Mustang flew over the ruins of the Reich, how it escorted bombers to the very end, and how its legacy continued long after the guns of 1945 fell silent. As 1945 began, the final chapter of the European conflict unfolded. The Wehrmacht, already crippled by months of relentless Allied bombing, found itself in disarray. Armies retreated, cities lay in ruins, and the once feared Luftwaffe was now a fraction of its former might. Yet despite this collapse, the skis remained a critical theater. Control of the air meant the difference between swift victory and prolonged chaos. And once again, the Mustang proved decisive. Allied bombers pressed deeper into Germany, striking critical targets in Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley. Factories that had once churned out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were now smoldering ruins. Bridges and rail lines essential to troop movement had been destroyed. Fuel depots, storage facilities, and military installations were in flames. Each raid weakened Germany's capacity to resist the advancing Allied armies. Above these strikes, Mustangs patrolled relentlessly. Pilots flew long hours, sometimes 12 to 14 hours in a single mission, ensuring bombers remained protected. Dogfights were rarer now, but when they came, they were decisive. The remaining German aircraft, often piloted by inexperienced teenagers, were systematically destroyed. Each kill further eroded the Luftwaffe's morale and capability. Veterans from the Mustang squadrons recall these final months as a mixture of triumph and melancholy. The victories were decisive, yet the cost of war was ever present. Even as the Reich crumbled, pilots mourned the comrades they had lost along the way, yet they also knew that their aircraft had changed the course of the war. Without the Mustang, the bomber offensive would have suffered catastrophic losses. And the liberation of Europe might have been delayed by months, if not years. The weapon that had altered the war in 72 hours continued to define the conflict through its final days. From escorting bombers over the heart of Berlin to strafing retreating German convoys, the Mustang ensured that Germany could not regroup. It was a machine of persistence, endurance, and precision. Pilots often described the feeling of flying these missions as a combination of power and responsibility. They were not merely fighting for their lives, but for the success of a broader campaign that would determine the fate of millions. The final weeks of the war saw dramatic encounters. Even the advanced Me-262 jets and other desperate German countermeasures could not match the Mustang's versatility. In one remarkable mission over southern Germany, a small squadron of Mustangs intercepted a formation of Me-262s attempting to disrupt a bomber raid. Using superior tactics and coordination, the Mustang pilots downed multiple jets before the bombers reached their target, demonstrating the aircraft's adaptability even against next-generation threats. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered. The skies over Europe, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, were now filled with the roar of Allied engines in celebration rather than combat. Cities still lay in rubble, but the war's end was undeniable. The Mustang had flown over the heart of the Reich, escorting bombers, striking ground targets, and ensuring the Allies could press their advantage. The legacy of this weapon extended far beyond the war. Its design influenced post-war aircraft development, its success shaped air combat doctrine for decades, and its pilots became legends, embodying courage, skill, and determination. The Mustang was more than a plane. It was a symbol of the fusion of innovation, industrial might, and human bravery, a reminder that in the darkest moments of history, ingenuity could alter the course of events in ways that mere numbers alone could never achieve. The 72 hours that first revealed the Mustang's potential were only the beginning. In the years that followed, its story would inspire generations of aviators, engineers, and historians alike. It was a weapon. The story of the Mustang is, at its core, a story of transformation, how ingenuity, courage, and the relentless pursuit of superiority changed the fate of a world engulfed in conflict. It is the tale of a weapon that, in just 72 hours, revealed its potential to alter the course of history. Yet its impact was far more enduring than that single moment. The Mustang exemplified the fusion of science and strategy. Its sleek frame, powered by the Merlin engine, represented decades of technological evolution combined with an urgent need born from necessity. But technology alone does not win wars. The aircraft's triumph was inseparable from the men who flew it. Young pilots, some barely out of training, who risked everything to protect bombers, strike at the enemy, and assert control over skies that had long been dominated by fear and destruction. Every mission flown by a Mustang pilot carried layers of consequence. Each bomber protected was a factory still burning, a bridge still destroyed, a supply line disrupted, and most importantly, a life saved. The 72 hours that first demonstrated the Mustang's supremacy were only the beginning of a relentless campaign that wore down the Luftwaffe, cleared the skies for strategic bombing, and paved the way for the liberation of Europe. Historians often debate the turning points of the Second World War, the Soviet victories at Stalingrad, the landing at Normandy, the battles in the Pacific. Yet the arrival of the Mustang, seemingly ordinary at first glance, deserves a place among these decisive moments. It was not merely the numbers it could shoot down or the bombers it escorted, but the psychological and strategic dominance it enabled. The Allies, once cautious and wary of heavy losses, could now strike with confidence, knowing that their operations had a protective umbrella high above. Mustang also embodies the importance of collaboration. An American company responding to British requests combined ingenuity and speed to produce a fighter that would exceed expectations. British engineers improved its heart with the Merlin engine, and together across the Atlantic they created a weapon greater than the sum of its parts. This international cooperation underscores a lesson as relevant today as it was then: the power of shared expertise in the face of overwhelming challenges. As the war drew to a close, the Mustang continued to fly, escorting missions until the skies over Germany were finally free of enemy resistance. Its pilots returned home to a world that would never forget the role they had played. Streets, cities, and lives were rebuilt, but the roar of Mustang engines left an indelible mark on history. The legacy of this aircraft endures. It shaped modern air combat doctrine, inspired generations of engineers and pilots, and remains an iconic symbol of the Second World War. Museums around the world now preserve the few remaining Mustangs, silent testaments to the bravery of the men who flew them and the ingenuity that created them. In reflecting on the story of the Mustang, one sees not just a machine but a turning point. A reminder that even in the darkest hours, innovation, courage, and determination can shift the balance, sometimes in as little as 72 hours. From the factories of North America to the skies over Germany, it changed the war, saved countless lives, and left a legacy that would echo far beyond the battlefields of Europe. And so, as we look back, the Mustang stands as more than a fighter plane. It is a symbol of the decisive power of technology guided by human skill, of the courage of those who risked everything, and of the remarkable moments in history where a single weapon altered the fate of nations forever. The war may have ended, but the story of the Mustang continues, a testament to what can be achieved when ingenuity meets necessity and when courage soars alongside innovation. The story of the Mustang is more than a tale of war machines and battlefield victories. It is a chronicle of human ingenuity, courage, and determination, a testament to the transformative power of innovation in the crucible of conflict. In the early days of the Second World War, the skies over Europe were dominated by the Luftwaffe, an air force that struck fear into the hearts of pilots and civilians alike. Bombers flew with trepidation, escort fighters struggled to reach their targets, and losses mounted, threatening to stall the Allied advance. It was in this moment of desperation, when hope seemed fleeting, that the Mustang emerged, a product of collaboration, ambition, and relentless human effort. Its arrival marked not only a shift in military technology but a profound turning point in strategy, morale, and the very course of history. From the moment the Merlin-powered Mustang took to the skies, it redefined what was possible in aerial warfare. Bombers, once vulnerable and exposed, found guardians in these agile, powerful aircraft. Pilots who had faced near-certain death on every mission now felt a sense of protection and confidence that transformed their approach to combat. The 72 hours that showcased the Mustang's potential were only a glimpse of the impact it would have in the months that followed. Every mission flown, every enemy aircraft engaged, and every convoy strafed contributed to the dismantling of the Luftwaffe, gradually eroding Germany's ability to defend itself and paving the way for the liberation of Europe. The aircraft's combination of speed, range, maneuverability, and firepower made it a symbol of superiority, demonstrating that technological innovation, when paired with skill and determination, can reshape the outcomes of entire conflicts. Beyond the tangible victories, the psychological effect of the Mustang was profound. For Allied crews, it represented hope, a tangible assurance that their survival and mission success were possible even in the most perilous circumstances. For German pilots and commanders, it shattered illusions of invincibility, forcing them into a reactive, defensive posture as their once dominant air force faltered. This shift in perception was as decisive as any tactical engagement, illustrating the interconnectedness of technology, strategy, and morale in the theater of war. It underscored a truth that resonates far beyond military history. Power is not measured solely in numbers or firepower, but in the ability to inspire confidence, adapt, and innovate in the face of overwhelming challenges. The story of the Mustang is also one of collaboration, bridging continents and expertise to achieve a common purpose. American industrial capacity combined with British engineering brilliance to create an aircraft that exceeded expectations and changed the war. This partnership highlights the extraordinary results that arise when nations unite, ideas converge, and shared goals are pursued with precision and dedication. The Mustang became more than a tool. It became a symbol of unity, resourcefulness, and the human capacity to overcome adversity through ingenuity. As the war drew to a close, the Mustang continued to soar above the battlefields, escorting bombers, striking ground targets, and maintaining air superiority until the final days of the conflict. Its legacy extended beyond the destruction of the Luftwaffe and the collapse of Nazi Germany. It influenced future generations of aircraft design, informed air combat tactics for decades, and cemented its place in history as a turning point achieved not merely through force, but through vision, determination, and courage. The men who flew it, the engineers who built it, and the strategies that relied upon it all contribute to a narrative that is as much about human achievement as it is about war. The Mustang's story reminds us that history is often shaped in moments of ingenuity and decisive action. 72 hours may seem brief, yet in those hours the balance of power shifted, lives were saved, and the course of Europe was irrevocably altered. It is a story of courage in the cockpit, brilliance in the workshop, and the relentless pursuit of excellence under the most trying conditions imaginable. As we reflect on its impact, the Mustang stands as an enduring symbol of what can be accomplished when innovation meets necessity, when courage meets skill, and when vision meets opportunity. It is a testament to the extraordinary potential of human endeavor, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, decisive action, creativity, and perseverance can alter the course of history forever.